The karate chop is one of the most divisive strikes in all of martial arts, mostly because it's 90% useless. But 90% useless is still 10% useful. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the various versions of the karate chop, why I like them, why I dislike them, and why they might be worth incorporating into your martial arts training. As always, you guys, make sure you're subscribed and you have notifications turned on. That way, you never miss a new video. So, the karate chop, or the judo chop if you don't know what you're talking about. It's when you take the side of your hand, or the knife edge of your hand, and you chop at your opponent. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this, and in this case, I don't actually want to say the way is wrong. There's one way that I think is wrong, but for the most part, there's just different uses for them. Think about it this way. Your standard strikes, your jabs, crosses, hooks, elbows, those are a Phillips head screwdriver. Those are useful most of the time. But your half beat strikes, your knife hands, your hammer fist, your forearm strikes, those are screwdrivers that are named after somebody else besides Phil. Those have a very specific use, and they can't be used in most situations, but when you need them, you better have them. The most standard way to throw your karate chop is when you stand in horse stance, load up your striking arm, and hinge at the elbow. This is where people get the idea that the karate chop is weak, because yes, if your punch only comes from the hinge of the elbow, there's not a lot of power behind it. But not every strike needs to be a knockout strike. A chop at the elbow to someone's throat can do enough damage. There's a big difference between hitting as hard as possible and hitting hard enough. So, while I would say this isn't the best option to throw the karate chop, it is still an option. But the version that I prefer to use is instead of going just at the elbow, you use the whole body to throw the karate chop. Now, in this case, this looks a lot like the standard hammer fist, and to tell the truth, more often than not, I prefer throwing a closed fist strike than an open fist strike, but there is a reason and a time to strike like this versus like this. If you and I are in a situation and we're already geared up and we're already fighting, then yes, my hands need to be closed, and more often than not, it's going to be easier to strike with my fist closed like this. But if we're not quite there yet, if we're just here having a disagreement and I'm trying to diffuse a situation, you'll notice that my hands are open. If I realize that I'm failing at de-escalating and it's time to escalate, instead of going straight for a closed fist strike, I might opt to save some time by going straight for an open palm like this. So yes, you have the option to throw open fist strikes in the middle of a fight and closed fist strikes before the fight starts, but more often than not, if you're trying to avoid fighting and the fight does start, your first move is going to be with the hand open. And in that case, you might as well know what you're doing. Going back to what I was talking about, throwing a full body knife hand strike is like slipping to set up your cross. So I'm going to be here, load up my left leg. I'm going to sit back on my left leg, but at the same time, my knife hand is going to come across my body. From here, yes, I can turn quickly into that cross, but I can also unload and throw my knife hand strike. So I'm going to bring my hand to the opposite shoulder, load the hip, loosen up through the shoulder and the elbow, and fling my strike at my opponent. Again, I'm here, boom. What this needs to do is get in my opponent's face, so as I move it, there's my rear hand. The knife hand is a half beat strike that sets up your bigger strikes. A half beat and a full beat strike is, for me, the difference between boxing punches and karate punches. What I mean is, if I'm here and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, those are full beat strikes. The count is 1, 2, 3, 4. In between those, I can put half beat strikes, which don't require a full rotation of the body. Meaning, I can come here and I can go 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Or if you want to get even more fancy, you can go 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5, so on and so forth. You don't need to turn all the way through the body to throw half beat strikes. But because they're half a beat, you can think of them as being half as powerful. But again, it doesn't need to be a full power strike to do damage. Now, that's talking about the standard knife hand strike, which is probably the one that's most useful for people, because 9 times out of 10, you're either standing in the guard, meaning it's going to be easy to fire out like this, or if you're defending yourself, your hands are going to be up here, meaning it's easy to fire from here, or even if your hands are low, it's easy to just rise into the knife hand strike. But that's not the only version. The other version that you see most often is the standard judo chop, where instead of it coming across, it comes down. And this is where I think karate chops start to look kind of ridiculous, because for whatever reason, a closed downward hammer fist looks way more dignified than an open karate chop. Can't tell you what it is, but that's just a fact. However, that doesn't mean this version of the strike is useless. Now, again, you can do this as just a hinge like this, or you can use the whole body, whichever version you prefer. But the important thing to remember is why you would do this. A lot of times people will tell you downward strike at someone's neck to put them to sleep. I guess you could, but that's not usually how I like to do it. The way I like to think of the downward knife hand strike is if someone's standing in a good tight guard and I peel it out of the way, my knife hand can follow up right away. And usually what happens is when you land that strike, and again, this is with regard to what rule set you're playing in. If you're only allowed to hit with the front of the knuckles, then obviously don't do this. But if you're doing MMA or you just don't care about the rules, do whatever you want. You peel the guard and strike down where the jaw meets the neck or where the neck meets the shoulder. Either way, what's gonna happen is they're gonna jar backwards. At that point, it's very easy to follow up with whatever you want to follow up with. So we've talked about using the horizontal knife hand as a preemptive strike for self-defense and the downward knife hand after you peeled your opponent down in sparring. But it's important to remember that you can use these at any time. You can use the knife hands as limb destruction. Now, will these be the deadly goon tings that people are always talking about where the opponent is no longer able to fight? Probably not, but it will be annoying and they will have to deal with it. And when they do start moving their hand out of the way, boom, that's when it's easy to follow up. So there's a very specific way to use the knife hand strikes, and you have to learn and experiment to figure out the best way to work for you. But that's talking about the horizontal knife hand strike and the downward knife hand strike. Now, let's talk about the one that breaks my heart, because I personally love these strikes in every version, and my favorite version is the inverted strike. We do a lot of this in Kajukenbo. More often than not, we'll practice it where the opponent steps forward and throws their punch like this, and our job is to block it down, and over the top we come with our inverted knife hand strike. This strike is super cool looking, but I can't really figure out a reason to do it. Yes, I just made a big case for using knife hand strikes in various situations, but I can't really justify throwing the knife hand strike like this. I guess I could see if you're still trying to hit someone in the throat, this might be the way to go, but in this case, I like to think about the knife hand strike as kind of a winging strike to the throat. I'm not trying to go and cut someone's trachea out. What I'm trying to do is just quickly tap it, which means if I'm doing this when someone's already hitting me, I'm risking them just working through that pain. So instead of going downward block, inverted knife hand, I'll probably just come cup strike to the throat. I find it's a little more useful than the inverted knife hand. So it breaks my heart because I love throwing this strike, but I just can't find where it's useful. There's one more version of the knife hand strike that I want to talk about. And this is actually where you fail with the knife hand strike. Because the knife hand depends on you being far enough from your opponent that you can land with your hand, which is great because in sparring, we're constantly controlling range. We're constantly able to decide when we want to strike and when we don't want to strike. But in self-defense, we don't necessarily get the luxury of controlling range. That is the goal, but that doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes, while we're here, boom, all of a sudden the fight comes to us, which means if I'm going to throw my knife hand strike, I might miss the range, and boom, all of a sudden now I'm hitting with the forearm. So let's say my opponent here, the combat corner bag, rushes towards me. I use my knife hand strike, but instead of making contact with the hand, I make contact with the forearm. This is the standard combative crash that we're taught in every self-defense class. As the opponent rushes towards you, boom, you crash in like this. If your opponent's too close, throw some forearm strikes. They're just as effective as elbows. The only difference is instead of cutting your opponent open, it's a blunt object force. I think the forearm is one of the most underrated weapons in all of martial arts, just like I think the knife hand is. So that was my rant on the karate chop, the judo chop, the shuto knife, or whatever the hell they call it in aikido. Whatever you decide to call it, that's what I talked about today. Is it the most useful strike of all time? No, but not everything is. Is it important that you have a good uppercut? Only if you already have a good jab. So there's a tiered list to the strikes that you need to know, but that doesn't mean the things at the bottom of the list aren't important. If you think there might be a place for shuto knives in your martial arts training, then try them. If you don't, then you're right. But as for me, I do happen to think the knife hand can be a very useful tool to have in your arsenal, particularly if we're talking about self-defense, personal protection. In sparring, it's kind of iffy, especially if you're required to only strike with the front of the hand. But if you're not, boom, do whatever you want. But again, if you're spending most of your time working on just going, ha, block, chop, downward chop to cut off the head, you're probably not paying enough attention to just your standard boxing striking. But again, that's on you. Anyways, you guys, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. If you did, please make sure you're subscribed and you have notifications turned on. And when you're done with that, click open the description box down there at the bottom. There you'll find a whole bunch of links and codes to get yourself some of the best gear on the planet, as well as combat self-defense merch, and figure out how to contact me. As always, you guys, this has been Rob from Combat Self-Defense. I want to thank you for all the hard work. Thank you for the hard work yet to be done, and I'll see you next time.